introduction.
Ten, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this virtual committee, House of Lords Union Committee. And welcome back, Mr. Gove, and welcome for the first, Mr. We're very grateful for you both coming. We know you're immensely busy and spending time with us this afternoon. As a public evidence session, we'll be taking a transcript, which we will forward on to you in due course, and we'll be grateful of any corrections. I would also ask you to be crisp in your responses. We have many members and many questions, and that would enable us to use our time to the best effect. Each member of the committee has been allocated 5 minutes in which to ask their questions and supplementary questions, and I'll call them in order. At the end of our time, I'm hoping there will be a period where we could have some supplementary questions in either 2 or 3 minute dollops as well, but we will come to that and discuss that later in our session. Perhaps I could start, Mr. Frost, by asking you this question. Your recent correspondence with Michel Barnier has showed a state of play in the negotiations far removed from the broad outline of an agreement that the government had hoped to achieve by the June high-level meeting. Given this and the government's ruling out of an extension, is the June meeting still a watershed moment for the negotiations?
Thank you, Chairman. You're right. We obviously are quite a long way from the broad outline of an agreement that we hope to be at this point. We are, I guess, frustrated that it is clear from the discussions that we've been having in the last few months that a free trade agreement and the economic aspects of this negotiation could be agreed pretty quickly, but that other issues like the level playing field, like fisheries and so on, get in the way. I hope we can make some constructive progress next round and in the run into the high-level meeting. Obviously, it's going to be limited. We have to see how that high-level meeting can be used to make progress in the best way. Personally, I hope it can be a way of giving some new impetus, but we'll have to see what the market will bear at the moment.
Thank you very much. Did you have something to add to that, Michael Gove?
No, I think David summed it up perfect.
In that case, I'll come back with some questions later on, and for now, I'm going to hand over to Lord Wood.
Hello. Thank you, Mr. Gove, Mr. Frost, for being here. Mr. Frost, could I ask you a couple of questions about the choreography of June? What is the sequence that you envisage of the choreography, if you like, between the June Joint Committee meeting, the high-level meeting, and the European Council on the 18th of June?
They're all, to some extent, some of those points are fixed and some are not. We haven't yet fixed the high-level meeting, though we're obviously talking to the Commission about that. It's, I think it is very likely still to be in June, I would guess in the last week of June. I think in an ideal world, you would have a negotiating round next week. You would have some stocktake at the European Council, and then you would jump off with new impetus from the high-level meeting after that. We'll have to see if that's where the EU is. They've got a lot on their plate with other negotiations, other issues, and you know, it's not yet clear they've got the focus on this negotiation that will enable us to get to that point.
Right. So will there be an opportunity for further negotiations if there is if no progress is being made in the scheduled 1st of June round, at least you're saying these deadlines are quite movable in order to accommodate more time for meeting of minds?
Well, we're all working on the assumption that there will be further rounds after the European Council and the high-level meeting. I'm expecting there to be one towards the end of June. I'm sure there'll be at least one more round in July. So, you know, negotiations are going to continue. I think the question for us really is, for the UK, we've got to balance two things. We've got to balance on the one hand, the need to keep talking as long as there is a constructive process happening, which at the moment there is. And, you know, at some point, our need to provide maximum certainty to businesses, economic operators about what's going to happen at the end of the year. So, you know, the Canada and Australia outcomes, to use the shorthand, are similar, but they're not identical. And at some point, we have to be clear about what business has to be ready for. So, you know, we will talk in a constructive way as long as there's a constructive process in being. But at some point, prioritising readiness for the end of the year will loom larger than the negotiating process. But I would say we're not at that point at the moment, but as a matter of logic, it will come.
But from what you say, it sounds like the June deadline for an extension request is neither here nor there. It won't be used under any circumstances. Is that true? Are there any circumstances to do with the negotiation that would prompt you to actually consider an extension request?
Well, obviously, I work within the policy that's set by the Prime Minister and the committee that sets policy in this area. You know, the government's position is pretty clear that, you know, we are not going to ask for an extension, and if the EU asks for one, we will not agree to that. So I think that's just part of the framework now, and we're working to an end-year deadline.
Okay, and on the question of consultation with them to begin to prepare for the exit to the transition period, if indeed there is no agreement, at what point will there be discussions with business about that eventuality?
Well, I think that is really a question perhaps for CDL on the readiness side. He's focusing on the negotiations proper.
Yeah, we are engaging with business now. The business knows that, as David pointed out, while there are significant differences between in the shorthand, a Canadian and an Australian style deal, for business, they will need to be ready for customs declarations and other processes. So the business process of making sure that you have customs agent capacity or intermediaries who can ensure that those declarations are filled in are pretty much the same come what may. Obviously, everyone's attention has been distracted by COVID-19, but we're anticipating building up our engagement with business for the changes that they will inevitably require. Of course, the other thing is if we're outside without a Canada-style agreement, there'll be the additional process of tariffs to be paid on some goods. But in many respects, while tariffs, of course, are significant in some sectors, the biggest bureaucratic challenge is making sure that people are ready for being outside the customs union. And so business broadly knows, so there is much work still to be done, what that will require. And HMRC and others are engaging with business on that.
Thank you. Just one quick final question, a follow-up to my early one, Mr. Gove. If indeed the European Council comes back and says, look, we really do need a little extension to this transition period in order to get the basics sorted out, is the government's position that it will say no to that request?
Yes.
Okay, thank you for your clarity. That's all.
Very good and crisp. Thank you very much. Baroness Brown.
Thank you, Lord Chairman, and good afternoon, gentlemen. I wonder if I might follow up with Mr. Gove some of the discussion that we were just having. We heard in our discussions in Northern Ireland with businesses how essentially desperate they were to know what preparations they should be making, and I think you've touched on this. But I'd like to ask you if you could expand a bit on what mechanisms and support you're considering to facilitate an orderly transition from what happens today to the requirements of the future relationship. And I wonder perhaps if you could tell us a bit more about when the proposed business forum will start its work and what it will be doing. Thank you.
Yes. With respect specifically to Northern Ireland, Northern Ireland business had a wide range of views on the protocol, but there was no near universal welcome, not 3 cheers, but certainly 1.5 for the publication of our command paper on the protocol, which laid out the principles by which Northern Ireland businesses will continue to have unfettered access to the rest of the United Kingdom's internal market, and also laid out some additional processes that will need to be undertaken when goods are moving from Britain to Northern Ireland in order for us to play our part in protecting the EU's single market. Our business engagement has now begun with the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland and his team leading that. Of course, there are still some issues to be worked out, but one of the things that we have said to the Northern Ireland Executive is that any additional cost will not be borne by them, but by the UK government.
And can I, since you've touched on the unfettered access, can I just ask you how we square the absence of a requirement for exit summary declarations with Article 5 of the protocol?
Our view is that it's for the UK to administer the protocol, and we see that if we are prepared to bear the risk, which I think is very, very small, that goods may enter into our internal market through a Northern Ireland back door, as it were. If we are prepared to bear that risk, that is not a problem for the EU, it is a problem for us. So it is theoretically possible that there might be a loss of revenue. It is theoretically possible that goods that may not meet our standards enter in through that. But we're confident that other steps, market surveillance and so on, would mean that that risk would be minimal.
Thank you. And if I might follow up with a change of topic, there's no mention of Horizon Europe in the draft legal texts that were published recently. So I wondered if you could give me an update on the negotiations for full association with Horizon Europe, because clearly universities are worried about a lot of things at the moment, but that is one of the things that they are particularly concerned about as well.
Sure, happy to do that. We are talking to the Commission about Horizon Europe and 3 or 4 other programs that we're interested in participating in if we can find the right terms. We haven't published our own text on that, principally, although we keep the right to do so, but principally it seems that because these are EU programs, it is kind of logical to work off their text rather than writing our own. So this is a slightly special case in this process. We've begun discussions. There are a number of areas that still remain to be clarified. In particular, the Commission has proposed a mechanism which would mean that in no circumstances could the UK be a net recipient from any of these programs, only a net contributor. There are some provisions about the terms of access, the GDP key, the terms on which either side could exit the programme that need to be sorted out. So if we can sort these out, then we're very much open to participation, and actually the negotiation is pretty constructive, but we're still some way from agreement on it.
And can I just follow up quickly with Mr. Gove, that if we haven't got an agreement on this by January 2021, what measures is the government planning to support our universities and companies to continue with key research and key collaborations?
The Prime Minister has made it clear that we will match every penny, indeed exceed any loss of funding from participation in Horizon, so that science continues to be well funded, scientific research, I should say, well funded in our universities. Of course, as you know far, far better than me, there are other impacts on our universities as a result of COVID-19. And I think that we will need to ensure that we're even more determined to support scientific research. It has to be one of the top priorities for future government expenditure overall.
Thank you, that's good to hear.
Thank you very much. Baroness Cootie.
Yeah, so sorry, so a bit of trouble unmuting. Could I ask Mr. Frost, when Mr. Gove appeared before us on the 5th of May, he indicated that we would be willing to accept non-regression clauses, but not an additional level playing field provisions that might, for example, require alignment to EU law regulations. If we set state aid on one side for a moment, could you say what the EU proposes beyond non-regression in areas of labour, the environment and taxation? What additional things may they be asking for that may restrict potentially our ability to enter into free trade agreements with countries outside the EU?
Thank you. Yes, it's quite complicated, but I'll be as brisk as I can. On labour, they are suggesting that there should be as you say, non-regression from EU standards. So that's EU standards is important. They are suggesting that enforcement mechanisms need to be in place domestically, which they are. They're proposing a ratchet clause, which is complicated, and I can say more about that if you wish. And obviously they're proposing that what happens in this area should be subject to a dispute settlement mechanism that includes the European Court of Justice. So that's what's over and above that. On environment, it's rather like that, except that they would like us to establish an independent authority to police ourselves, as it were, in the environment area. And on climate, they would like us to commit to carbon pricing and to the Paris Agreement as an essential element of the agreement. Tax is a bit different. It isn't normally a part of an FTA in quite this way. What they're proposing is commitment to good governance and OECD standards, where we don't have a big difference between us, of course. They're proposing non-regression on 3 specific tax measures around anti-avoidance, which really equate to EU directives, and again, policed by a dispute settlement mechanism that involves the European Court of Justice, and we have some problems with that aspect of this. Though generally on tax, we have similar principles, as you would expect. So that's the sort of slightly complex and in some areas actually unprecedented arrangements that are being proposed.
And I mean, I accept that politically we're going to try and hold firm on this. If we were forced into any form of compromise, how would that impact the free trade agreements we may want to enter into with third countries? And is there anything else in the regulations that is currently within the EU that we have to adhere to, that they're trying to ensure that we stay adhering to, that could equally protect their markets in the UK? I'm thinking particularly of agriculture, viticulture, automotive, those important big industries for the EU, where I can see that they would want to try to protect their market in the EU, where they feel they could be undermined by free trade agreements with countries who could produce those products perhaps more cheaply.
Yes, there's a lot in that. I think on issues of regulation of goods like cars and so on, obviously it's a given that if we're exporting to the EU market, then we meet EU standards. That's clear. What the EU is doing is really sort of making a virtue of that fact and not doing anything in its offer to ease the movement of such goods across the border. I mean, in most free trade agreements, there are facilitations for mutual recognition of such products, for particular measures to improve to reduce the barriers to trade in particular sectors, and none of that is on offer at the moment, although we would like it to be on offer because it's quite standard stuff. To answer the first part of your question just briefly, any area obviously that affects our domestic discretion to regulate potentially can have an effect on other free trade agreements, because deep free trade agreements are about regulation as much as they're about goods. So that's an abstract answer. Obviously, it depends. You have to wait till we're actually negotiating more FTAs to be more specific about it.
So if I understand what you've just said, what you're saying is that the EU is resisting a mutual recognition of standards, particularly as we may or may not start to diverge from the EU regulations. And that in turn, if we do diverge, may impact on the types of free trade agreements we could negotiate with other countries. If we accept that, if obviously we're holding our line, but if we had to accept that.
Yes, I mean, it's clear that we will hold our line on this. But I mean, for example, we're not talking about mutual recognition of different standards and goods. What we're talking about is that, for example, each side agencies can recognise goods against different standards. So a UK agency could say a good met UK standards and that it also met EU standards. so you didn't have to have the same good policed in different places. That's not on offer.
I think if you
How
didn't
does that
mind,
work over time?
sorry, Baroness Kuti,
Sorry.
I regret that we need to move on to Lord Oates.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Gove and Mr. Frost. Following on from Baroness Kuti's questions, Mr. Frost, could you set out for the committee your view of the ratchet clauses proposed by the EU, for instance, in respect of environmental standards?
Yes, it's not terribly clear from the legal text, so we have talked to them, obviously, about this in some depth. And the way they appear to interpret it, though this is slightly interpretation of the legal text rather than very easily derived from it. The example they give is that, suppose, they give a numerical example. So suppose that we leave the transition period with standards that equate to, say, 5 out of 10 at the point of exit. Now, if we voluntarily increase our standards to, say, 8, and they increase their standards to, say, 7 over time, we cannot then fall back below 7, that there's a mutual commitment to the higher standard. So it doesn't require us both to move in parallel, but if we both choose to move for higher standards, those standards are locked in. That's the explanation they give. We have a number of problems with this. One, that it doesn't seem that easy to define standards in quite that simple way. I mean, sometimes there are numerical components, sometimes they're not, they're qualitative, and it's not obvious what a comparable standard is. And second, that they propose a dispute settlement mechanism which involves the European Court interpreting areas of EU law in this area, and since much of this in their construction, would be quite EU law-like, we feel that would not be a balanced arbitration process if we got into any argument about standards. So, and this is wholly novel. We're not aware of any agreement that has anything like this, and it seems quite complicated to run, quite apart from the issues of principle that it raises.
Could I just follow that up by asking Mr. Gove? We obviously have quite a good reputation leading the way on environmental standards and on climate issues. Might there not be some specific advantage to the UA in the ratchet clauses?
Well, we respect the position that the EU might wish to take. There are two things I'd say. The first is that the Office of Environmental Protection, which is a new body that will be set up in the Environment Bill, it's intended to be set up in the Environment Bill, is a body that we wish to set up anyway. But it was also the case during the negotiation of the withdrawal agreement that the EU recognised that this would be a body which would ensure that the broad environmental principles that most civilised countries take account of, the polluter pays principle, the precautionary principle, would be policed in the UK in accordance with policies set out by the UK government. The EU were broadly satisfied at the time that this would mean that we would not be renegated, and it was our belief actually that the model that the OEP offered would be one that others might seek to emulate. But the point I think was made by the Prime Minister in his Painted Hall speech that while we absolutely wanted to continue to be leaders in environmental standards and in other areas, we would not ourselves place an obligation on the EU. We don't want to use these negotiations in any way to fetter them. And I think this goes to David's point, which is that the level playing field requests and the way in which they've been decided or argued for are one sovereign equal seeking to fetter another sovereign equal, and we don't take that view.
Thank you. And then just finally from me, Mr. Frost, could you tell us how you respond to Michel Barnier's claim in his letter to you that the level playing field provisions, including on state aid, don't mean that the UK would continue to be bound by EU law?
Well, I think that the draft treaty that they have put forward clearly shows that we would be bound by EU law in the state aid area. Indeed, there's an obligation to carry on to adopt it dynamically. As EU law changes, that we would have to change our domestic law to match it with penalties if we didn't choose to. I'm sure and confident that Michel Barnier knows that well, and I read his letter accordingly as part of the ongoing process of negotiation.
Thank you.
Lord Kerr.
Good afternoon. Question for Mr. Frost, please. Last time he saw us, Mr. Gove told us he'd be willing to consider some tariffs on some trade with the EU if this solved the level playing field problem. Which tariffs? How did you, or how would you pick them? Wouldn't this breach the WTO MFN basic rule?
Well, yes, we brought this into the discussion because obviously we prefer zero tariffs, zero quotas as the outcome. We've committed to that in the political declaration. That's what we're working for. But what we're trying to do is find a way through the level playing field problem. And if you like, at the moment, we've got a choice, and a binary choice in these negotiations, which is zero tariffs with lots of level playing field or no agreement. And it seems that there is a way in the middle of this, which is level playing field characteristic of a free trade agreement with free trade agreement like levels of access. So 98, 99% tariff free, but a small amount. So obviously we've got to discuss with the EU whether this is a productive way forward. I'm not sure it is at the moment, but we've put it on the table. Obviously, we'll have to have, if it is a way forward, we'll have to have a discussion about which tariffs would be excluded from the process. There's precedents, obviously, and they tend to be in agriculture, but that will be a policy decision. So that's the state of the process that we've got to. I don't think it would bring in WTO MFN provisions as I see it. It would simply be it would put us in a situation analogous to Canada or other countries that have a free trade agreement that doesn't cover quite everything.
Substantially all trade, but you're saying it'd be a very limited number. Question to Mr. Gove, please, a wider question. In his Greenwich speech on the 3rd of February, that rather odd speech in which he warned the world against getting into a panic about coronavirus, Mr. Johnson said, quote, "Humanity needs the UK to take off its Clark Kent spectacles and play Superman, the supercharged champion of free trade." And in that spirit, you, Mr. Gove, used to say that if there was no deal with the 27, we'd put no tariffs on our imports from them and challenge them to do the same. Well, you don't seem to be saying that now. We seem to have ditched the Superman cape and published WTO tariff plans. Do you now agree that no deal with the world's largest free trade area would mean these tariffs on imports from our largest supplier and their tariffs on our exports to our largest market? And wouldn't that be quite a big step back from free trade?
Well, there's several points there. The first thing is that the Prime Minister was warning specifically about a retreat to autarky in the wake of the pandemic, and he made the point that we need international cooperation, and we've seen that, scientific, procurement and otherwise. So I think it's only fair to say that the Prime Minister was right to say that a retreat into full-on protectionism in the face of COVID-19 would be a mistake. It is the case, of course, that COVID-19 has exposed the fact that there may be an over-reliance in some areas on some markets, and therefore what we need to do is have even greater diversification, which would, of course, help promote freer trade overall. On the point about the tariff schedule that we've published, I think it's fair to say that it's more liberal than the EU's approach, and that we've gone for simplification of a number of areas where the EU have a more complex approach. For example, the Mersing table, which covers agricultural goods, we're radically simplifying. So in that sense, it is a step forward to free trade. So of course, It's only one step. We want to take further steps by concluding free trade agreements with other countries as well.
But you would be putting tariffs on the country that is the largest exporter to us. So a large number of goods sold in the UK would be carrying a tariff. Would they be more expensive?
Yes, and that would be a hit for the EU. It is one that they might want to take, but as is well known, the EU has a surplus in trade in goods with the UK. There are some economists, I'm not one of them, but there are some economists who argue that if you are a deficit country when it comes to goods, then it is economically rational to have tariffs, because, of course, it's a way of making sure that you increase government income and also penalise your competitors. I don't take that view, but it is a respectable view held by some. The people who would suffer most as a result of this would be EU producers.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm sorry to have to stop at Lord Kerr in full flight there, but could we move please to Baroness Neville-Rolfe?
I wanted to follow up, if I might, on tariffs first, with two questions. Have you assessed the impact of any such tariffs on UK businesses? You mentioned EU businesses, but UK businesses, the supply chain, and indeed the economy overall. And is there a comparable precedent for an FTA inclusive of tariffs being agreed so quickly? You know, we've only got a few months left.
Well, I'll try and answer it, and then David may come in with real expertise. On the first point, it is the case that we're assessing overall, in the light of COVID-19, exactly what the right approach should be in order to ensure that at a time when supply chains are being reviewed across every sector, what impact tariffs might have on them. But I think we're already seeing, even absent the conclusion of these negotiations, a drive towards a greater level of reshoring for a variety of reasons, not just COVID-19, but also as a result of changes in technology. We're seeing with respect to Japan, we may see it with respect to automobile manufacture here. So tariffs are one factor, but only one factor as supply chains are reviewed. And on the point about your second point, I think I'll hand to David, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Because, again, I think it's a matter of will rather than technicality.
Yeah, so your question was, you know, are there comparable examples? I mean, obviously, this is a highly unusual situation. Most free trade negotiations are about reducing barriers. This is an unusual one in the sense that we're coming out of the customs union, we're coming out of the single market and put in place a different institutional arrangement. So yes, it is unusual. That is one of the complexities of this negotiation. Obviously, as a policy decision, the government's view is that the benefits of having regulatory control yourself and of controlling your own customs arrangements in the long run outweigh the cost. But obviously, we'd like to minimise that cost if we can.
Right. So there isn't really a precedent because it's a completely different situation.
I'm not aware of a precedent. I mean, there may be one on a sort of micro scale, but I'm not aware of a major country doing this. We all know this is an unprecedented and unusual situation.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, on a slightly different tack, Mr. Frost, your letter suggested that it's quite possible that a deal won't be concluded by the end of the year, at least I think in several important respects. I mean, it seems to me there'll be some economic challenges, but there could also be some opportunities from that situation. Clarity, I think you've already mentioned. Can you expand a little bit on the opportunities side?
Well, first of all, I would say it's not our preference. We would like to get a deal, and certainly my letter was not intended to signal that you know, we were looking not to reach an agreement. Far from it. It was intended to show that an agreement is perfectly possible, provided that the EU did not bring new and unprecedented elements to the discussion, and we would still like to reach an agreement. I think in terms of the opportunities, obviously one big opportunity is the ability to control your own trade and do free trade agreements with other countries more broadly, to lead the WTO in the trade world more generally, and to have regulatory control over your own rules in a way that makes us nimbler and more capable of responding, for example, to technological developments and the EU. That is a policy decision about the right regime for the UK, which the government has taken and was settled through the election and the referendum before that.
And Chancellor of the Duchy, is there anything you would add?
No, I think David sums up perfectly.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Lord Teverson.
Yes, perhaps I can start at a higher level on the fisheries side with yourself, Chancellor, Mr. Gove. You're recognised generally as being one of the most successful DEFRA Secretaries of State. You have family connections with the Scottish industry. So you know very well that fisheries is one of the most emotionally charged areas, perhaps, of this negotiation, not just on this side of the Channel and the North Sea, but the other side as well. So my first question really at that top level is, do you actually think there is a possibility of getting an agreement on fisheries? Can common ground actually be found? But is there a real chance that it won't be because the gap is so wide, and that will stop a wider deal happening by the end of the year?
Well, it is an area. Thank you very much, Lord Teflon, for your very kind words. And you're absolutely right. It is an area of significant contention. It's interesting that, as we understand it, Michel Barnier had a call with the fisheries ministers of various EU nations earlier this week, and he may or may not have been seeking some flexibility from them, but their message to him was to stand firm. So whether we're inflexible and they are resolute, or they are stubborn and we are principled, whichever way you cut it, there is a sense of a standoff there. Michel Barnier argues that he doesn't want to look to the past with his agreements, with this agreement. The precedents are all very well, but he wants to look to the future. But one of the contentions that David has made, and which I strongly agree with, is that on fisheries they are looking to the past. As you know well, stock management, climate have changed what's happening in our waters. We want to use a method, zonal attachment, which more accurately reflects where the stocks are and what their conservation condition is. The EU wants to stick essentially with a modified version of the relative stability mechanism, which relates back to where fish were when we joined the EU and what patterns of fishing were when we joined the EU. So again, I don't want to be unduly critical. If I were the Irish or the Danish fisheries minister, I would fight for my sector as well. But I do think that this is an area of real difficulty.
Perhaps this is Mr. Frost, but is an agreement by the 1st of July, which is what was hoped for, is there any chance of that whatsoever? And if so not, what's the implications of that, or where does it go from there?
Well, I said yesterday that I was beginning to think we might not make it by the 30th of June, and that's still true. I think it is now challenging. It is only an aspiration, of course, in the political declaration. It's not a requirement. I'm sure we'll carry on talking after the 30th of June. Obviously, at some point, there will need to be a negotiation on the arrangements for 2021, whether there's an agreement or not. And if there isn't an agreement, that will reflect the fact that we're an independent coastal state and will control access and fishing in our waters at that point. So that is the reality that the EU has to contend with if it doesn't evolve its position and try and reach an agreement with us.
Okay, but I mean, at the end of the day, fisheries is less than 1%, way less than the 1%, I think, of GDP, both on our side and their side. And I could sort of see a scenario where not getting there means that the EU refuses to have an agreement at all with us. Is that scenario possible, that this undermines the whole process?
Either side can establish linkages between any elements of the negotiation that it wishes, and you have to judge how credible those linkages are as you go through it. And I still believe it's in the collective interest to find an agreement on fishing and on everything else. And that's what we're trying to do.
I think I have about 50 seconds. Sorry, Mr. Gove. No, you carry on, please.
Just very briefly, Conor Neil, who's involved obviously in the negotiations when we joined the EU, said in his memoirs that fisheries were the most difficult issue then. That is, to be fair to Michel Barnier, one thing that hasn't changed.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Could we move on, please, to Baroness Donaghy?
Good afternoon, Mr. Gove and Mr. Frost. My question is about the mutual recognition of professional qualifications. And the first bit is for Mr. Frost, if I may. Your letter to Mr. Barnier states that the government's legal texts draw on precedent where relevant precedent exists. Yet the government's proposals on the mutual recognition of professional qualifications appear to go beyond existing precedents like CETA. Do you agree?
Well, I look at it slightly differently, I suppose. Let me make a general point first, which is that every free trade agreement is different. They're all tailored to the circumstances of the countries negotiating them, but they're all recognisably free trade agreements and not something else. Generally, there's been a process of improving and deepening free trade agreements over time, over the last 10 to 15 years as they've been negotiated. To say one example, the EU-Japan includes provisions on financial services cooperation that don't exist in CETA, and that reflects the realities of the economies and the interests. So, what is a free trade agreement is not something that has absolutely clear content. So in some areas we've thought it perfectly reasonable to put forward proposals that reflect the specificities of our economy and the EU one and particular starting point, but they're all free trade agreement like, they're all appropriate content for a free trade agreement, and they're not like being in the single market or anything like it, as has been suggested. So that's my sort of general point about why we put forward something slightly different on mutual recognition of qualifications. It's perfectly appropriate to a free trade agreement. It's just a little different to existing ones. I can go into more detail on the detail of what we proposed if you'd like that.
Yes, I think if the government could explain its rationale for departing from precedent in this area, it would be very, very helpful, and also to point out what the differences are between our approach and the EU's approach.
Yeah, well, just briefly, because it is very complicated, but basically existing free trade agreements, so Canada and so on, in this area, basically they establish it. All they do is establish a framework for agreeing mutual recognition of qualifications, and then both parties have to operate through that framework. And usually it's a two-step process. The industry groups and the authorities have to make a recommendation to the joint committee. The joint committee agrees it. The negotiators can then agree an agreement. And only when that is done can anyone start actually recognising any qualifications under that agreement. So it's not entirely surprising that, in fact, no such agreements have actually been established under any of these free trade agreements so far, and therefore not a single qualification has been recognised. So what we're suggesting is simply to go one step further, which is that to require the relevant authorities, both here and in the EU, to establish a system upfront from the start. It doesn't say what that system should be. It doesn't require the other party to accept qualifications. It just says there should be a system. So it's trying to get, if you like, to the end point that's in the Canada agreement at the start. It is trying to say, let's not spend ages working out what the framework agreement for establishing the qualifications is. Let's do that from the start and focus on the actual mutual recognition process. So it's an attempt, if you like, to sort of accelerate what's there, but not change the fundamental nature of it.
So how would you react to Mr. Barnier's indication that we're seeking favourable market access conditions for UK professionals?
I think I would say that's what a free trade agreement is about, and it is about establishing favourable market access for both sides. And there are plenty of professionals who come to the UK for whom this would be of benefit as well. And we don't think there's anything wrong with that. That's what these agreements are designed to do. Obviously, if the EU doesn't want to do it in this way, then we will have to find some other way of doing it that will be more like the Canada agreement. But we make no apology for putting forward. It seems perfectly reasonable that we should be trying to improve market access. It's not at all like being in the single market, where you have a single set of rules policed by a set of institutions and no choice about how you operate them.
Thank you very much indeed. Lord Lamont.
Good afternoon to you both. Hello? Good
afternoon.
Can you hear now?
Yes, we can.
Loud and clear.
Right. Good afternoon to you both. A question for Mr. Gove, if I might. How much progress has been made on the financial services negotiations, particularly the equivalence assessment, which should have been easy and should have been made or should be made by the end of June?
Well, you're absolutely right. It should be relatively straightforward. It's a process for the EU, but given the skills that they have and given the knowledge that they've acquired of our financial services sector, then and I would have hoped, as I'd indicated earlier, that adequacy would have been granted. But there may be more that David can say about the smoke signals that have emanated from the negotiations themselves. I mean, obviously, the negotiations are about the future. This is about whether or not we pass a particular test now. But over to David.
So on equivalence, obviously the process has begun, and the Treasury is in regular contact with the Commission about all this. And some pretty hefty documents have been exchanged by way of questionnaires, which is in a way a little surprising, since the EU knows our system perfectly well and knows what directives we are abiding by and how we do it. But there we are. We go through the process, and it's a constructive one. We don't see why this need take a long time, but we are in the EU's hands as to how long it takes. We're conducting our own assessment of the EU's equivalence to us on the same timescale. So that's where we are. It's constructive, but there's a bit of a way to go yet before we get to the decision.
Could I ask another question to Mr. Gove? How important do you think an agreement is for the financial services sector? How easy would it find it to operate with no agreement at all? And are there any sectors of the financial services sector you think would be particularly vulnerable?
Yes, there would be some sectors that would be more affected, and some sectors that would be significantly less affected. Again, I'm no expert in financial services, but I think it is the case that if we look at everything from the sort of broad retail wholesale banking sector, there'll be some areas where their capacity to sell services into the EU would be affected. But I think it's important to look at the UK financial services sector in the round. And I think that there are several things. Firstly, it is the case that there's a concentration of expertise, not just in financial services, but in the business services that support it, legal, accountancy, and otherwise. Secondly, there are a few places in the world where you have such a deep and broad capital market. If it were the case, as I think I mentioned in the past, that the EU chose deliberately to raise the barrier themselves on access for our financial services to their market, the losers would be investors in equities in EU companies who would not be able to get the very best price for any transaction that they wanted. So it would be another example of potential self-harm on the EU's part. That potential self-harm, as I say, might have an impact on certain parts of our own financial services sector, but there are some part of our financial services sector, some funds and so on, that would be completely unaffected. More broadly, as we've seen in the past, it is the case that some EU rules on everything from bonuses to I've forgotten the name, the acronym of the particular restriction. We'll come back to it. But there are rules which have been designed by other finance ministries in the EU specifically to cause problems for our financial sector outside the EU, we won't be exposed to those risks. David.
Not much to add, only to note that, of course, equivalence isn't a single thing. It's a set of decisions under a set of separate directives. Many directives in many areas don't have equivalence provisions. So the relevant sectors are already preparing to operate without that because the possibility doesn't exist. So it's not a single binary equivalence or not. It's actually a much more variegated picture.
Could I ask Mr. Frost where we are on clearing houses? I mean, that was one area, clearing houses for derivatives and synthetic products, where the EU were threatening to repatriate them to the Eurozone. Have we managed to, either on a temporary or a permanent basis, find a solution to that situation?
Well, I believe that particular issue is one where there is an equivalence question, and therefore it's caught up with the broader equivalence process that's underway. I'm sure we can write with more detail if that's useful, but I think it's covered by my general answer earlier that this is going through the mill of the equivalence process.
Right, if you could possibly write, that would be helpful.
Thank you very much. That's a kind offer. Could we move to Lord Sharkey?
Mr. Gove and Mr. Frost, could I follow up briefly on Lord Lamont's question about clearinghouses, about CCPs? London Clearinghouse is a kind of key part of our financial services structure, and the European Systemic Risk Board is currently considering changing the rules governing the resolution of ailing central counterparties in order to prevent cascading failures. Are we part of those discussions? And what would be the effect on our financial services, the regulatory divergence amongst CCP regulating authorities?
I think I'd have to suggest that we wrote to you on that point. My own focus, obviously, is on the broad negotiations with the EU for the future, rather than that specific side of it. But we can certainly let you have more information.
That would be very helpful. But turning to the broader side of it, in that case, what reasons has the EU given for resisting the inclusion of provisions on regulatory cooperation for financial services, including consultation on a mechanism for deciding equivalence decisions?
Good question. We're not sure why they won't go down this road. What we are proposing is a set of arrangements rather like those that are already in the EU-Japan agreement, and it therefore seems a bit strange to us that this is a difficulty, but maybe it's a difficulty that will be overcome as we move forward in the negotiations. I think the EU's basic view is that this is not, at least in this context with us, is not something they think is appropriate to a free trade agreement and maybe needs to be captured in some other way. But we're not far enough down the road of discussions to know exactly where they want to take this.
Okay. But how have they responded to our proposal for the creation of a dispute settlement body for financial services in general?
Well, it's a little bit more. What we've proposed is a little bit more complicated than that, and it's more about bringing predictability to autonomous processes, so that we both know where we stand and there are no surprises. I think we are. I mean, I wouldn't want to go into the detail of everything that's said in the negotiations. I think they feel that we have a set of good arguments to which at the moment they don't want to respond or pick up in this negotiation in this way. But as I say, we are we're at a particular stage of the negotiation, and as we move forward, maybe things that aren't possible will become possible.
But is that, in some sense, a way of saying that there's a linkage between, say, fisheries and financial services?
I wouldn't say that. We wouldn't want to establish any such linkage ourselves. in that area. I think the EU is probably doing what any reasonable negotiator would do, which is to indicate that it doesn't want to move on things that are important to them until we are beginning to move on things that are also important to them. So, when we get into that dynamic process, maybe some of these things would become possible, but I don't think fisheries is something that we are going to link to anything.
Thank you very much. Baroness Primarolo. You're still muted, Baroness Primarolo.
I do apologise. My computer's playing up this afternoon. It's like computer won't let me ask the questions. Good afternoon, Mr. Gove and Mr. Frost. Could I turn to the question of data protection? And in the context of the adequacy decision required by the GDPR, I wondered, Mr. Frost, whether you could take us through the reassurance that you've provided to the Commission that at the end of the transition period, the UK will continue to replicate the EU standards on data protection, which is clearly important for both sides.
Yes, of course. So where we are is roughly parallel to where we are on the financial services equivalence process. So discussions have begun over adequacy. The first meeting was, I think, in early March, and we've published quite a lot of the material that has gone to the Commission. Again, we've provided extensive detail on all this, on how we've incorporated the GDPR and the Law Enforcement Directive. Once again, they know that very well, but we have provided it in any case. I mean, there's no doubt that, in our view, we're going to be data adequate at the point of exit because we're operating the same rules at the point of exit. So it would seem odd to us if there was any question mark about adequacy at that point. Looking to the future, we have made clear that we intend to operate a high quality data regime. That is obvious and goes past of being a high standard country. What we're not going to say is that we'll commit to follow whatever the EU does or the GDPR in every detail. And of course, the EU has granted adequacy to 13 countries, and none of those operate the GDPR, but they operate rules that are equivalent. And we are committed to high standards and intend to remain committed to it.
Thank you. You've touched there, Mr. Frost, on law enforcement. And the Prime Minister did make it clear in his February speech at Greenwich that we were going to establish our own sovereign controls with regard to data protection. So looking to the future, because this will be crucial, in the context of law enforcement and cooperation on criminal matters, what specific reassurances have you offered the EU 27 on data protection? This obviously is something that will need to be progressed quite quickly.
Yes, indeed. So we have offered the same reassurances in that context as we have in any other. Obviously, the legal framework is different, and of course there are two adequacy procedures going on, one under the GDPR and one under the Law Enforcement Directive, and we are the first country that has to undergo both. So there's a certain amount of a new precedent being established here. Our general point stands that we intend to be a high data standard country, processing data in the best possible way. The EU's view is that continuing data adequacy is a precondition for any kind of law enforcement cooperation. That's a position they're entitled to take, but it doesn't seem to be one that's absolutely necessary up front in a law enforcement agreement. So that's where those discussions have reached.
So could you expand a little more on the detail of exactly what is being said by the EU negotiators with regard to the reassurances that you've provided to them around data protection going forward?
Well, I think of necessity, those reassurances are general in the sense that the future is unknowable. Precisely what the circumstances we will be responding to are unknown, but we are committed to maintaining the highest possible standards, and it's obviously inherent in the future that we will be a separate jurisdiction in this area and doing things in the same way. And it's up to the EU to draw conclusions from what we do, but we do not believe we will give them any reason to doubt that we're a high standards country doing things in the best way.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, Baroness Pereira, I regret we need to move on. Lord Morris.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chancellor and Mr. Frost. I'd like to ask you about appropriate further safeguards if the governments wish to mimic Norway and Iceland. What do you mean by appropriate further safeguards?
Of course. So what we are suggesting is on extradition is that we should have an agreement between us that is rather like the EU-Norway agreement, as you say, which is similar to the arrest warrant arrangements, but different in some crucial ways. In particular, that you can bring extra safeguards and extra conditions into the process, which don't exist in the EU system and which have been quite controversial domestically here. So to take two examples, probably the two most important examples, proportionality is one safeguard that we are looking for. Some EU members have got a legal obligation to pursue every case, however trivial, and thus extradite citizens for minor offences, very minor theft offences, for example. And we think judges should have the right to refuse to surrender somebody under when they receive a warrant if the costs of that process and the associated process is not proportionate to the accusation against them. Another area is trial readiness. Again, this has been quite controversial. We think that judges should be able to refuse to extradite if a case is not basically ready to go to trial in the other country, or if or it's to ensure a sentence is served. What we think is not reasonable is that we should be required to extradite citizens simply to sit in a prison, essentially on remand for prolonged periods while an investigation is being conducted and while we don't know that any charges will be brought. So those are two of the main safeguards we want to bring into this process. They've not been agreed yet, but we are having a constructive discussion about them.
Do these aspirations go beyond EU law?
Well, they're different to EU law in the sense that the EU arrest warrant arrangements don't allow you to place these sorts of conditions. The Norway one does include some different conditions, and we're looking again for something that's a bit tailored to our particular circumstances and the needs of our legal system.
How will these arrangements be policed and enforced?
Well, they will take place under the legal provisions of the agreement. We propose, obviously, if there is a disagreement in a particular case, there will be the possibility for both parties, both governments, both sets of authorities to discuss that situation. What we don't think, and this is a general point about law enforcement agreements, we don't think they're appropriate to arbitration mechanisms, or still less the involvement of the European Court of Justice in them.
Well, we've heard evidence that the police are concerned that they will have much less availability to extradite. Is that the position that we envisage?
Well, the arrangement we're looking for is, as I said, similar to the Norway one, which is a streamlined process compared to what would happen if there was no agreement. In all these cases, there's a question of balancing correct process requirements and reasonable requirements for decent treatment of people against the requirements of law enforcement. And I've given two examples of where we think the arrest warrant didn't strike quite the right balance, and where we think it could be done in a slightly different way.
Thank you very much, Lord Morris. Indeed, I'm sorry to cut you off at the legs there,
No,
but
not at
I'm
all.
afraid we must move
Thank
on. Baroness Hamwee.
Well, thank you and good afternoon, gentlemen. You've just mentioned a couple of aspects of human rights, and can I take you, Mr. Frost, onto the issue of the European Convention on Human Rights. The political declaration, of course, requires continued adherence to it and refers to it as a commitment, and that's reflected in the EU's negotiating text. So I'm interested in why we apparently are refusing to include it, despite our role in its creation. Can you tell us why this is, and whether the EU understands why this is?
Yes, of course. We are members of the European Convention on Human Rights and members in good standing and intend to continue to be, and that is the situation whether or not that fact is mentioned in the law enforcement agreement or not. The EU's position is that it must be mentioned, and that cooperation should be conditioned on it. Over and above that, they're also saying that our domestic implementation of the convention must be subject to their supervision, and if they don't like our implementation of the convention, that the law enforcement arrangements can be collapsed as a result. And this seems to us to be wholly inappropriate in agreements like this, that how we implement our international commitments is a matter for us, and we intend to do that in good faith. So therefore the framework of the convention exists for law enforcement cooperation. It exists whether it is mentioned in the agreement or not, and it is very important to both sides. I would just add one point actually, that of course the EU itself cannot be party to the European Convention precisely because it will not accept an outside authority dictating its own internal arrangements, and we think that's a good principle to take into the agreement more broadly.
So a bit technical and a bit political. Reading the words in the political declaration there, continued adherence and giving effect to, does that leave some room for agreement as to what giving effect to means? Because wouldn't it look pretty awful if the UK appeared to be rowing back from the ECHR? Wouldn't it, apart from anything else, impact the good faith and our ability to reach agreement on a range of security issues?
We won't be. We take pride in the role that we played in the establishment of the convention in the first place, and we will remain subject to it and part of the court. The Human Rights Act, of course, like all legislation, can be updated and modernised. When Tony Blair was Prime Minister, of course, he brought it in, but he subsequently thought it might need review in one or two cases. But that's about making sure that human rights work better, not that we move away from them.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Lord Ricketts.
Thank you very much indeed. I want to pursue a couple of questions on the policing databases and alerting systems that have become so central to UK policing in the last decade or so. And start on the Schengen Information System, SIS2, with evidence from the National Police Chiefs Council lead on Brexit, Richard Martin, that last year UK policing accessed this system 603 million times. I wonder, I could ask David perhaps first, given that it's the government's aspiration to achieve capabilities similar to SIS2, even though there's been no precedent for a non-Schengen country to do that, what are the real negotiating prospects of getting something similar to SIS2? And perhaps for the Chancellor, if we don't, what are the mitigations we can put in place to help the police with those 603 million requests a year we won't be able to make next year?
So you're right. SIS2 is an important system, an extremely useful one. The difficulty is obviously that the EU have said that it's simply legally impossible for any non-Schengen and non-EU member state to be part of SIS2, and that appears to be a position they're very firm on. We're not sure exactly what the legal underpinning for that is, and certainly there are different views on the question here. So we hope that it may not be a completely closed one, but at the moment that is their position, and we regret it. But it obviously makes a negotiation pretty difficult to have. So that's where we are on that, and we hope they will think better of it as we move forward in the negotiation itself. If we don't agree it, obviously we would like other arrangements that come as close to it as possible. At the moment, the arrangement will be the Interpol alert system, which is definitely less satisfactory, but I think it would certainly be possible to develop something that is better than that and comes closer to what can be achieved in SIS2. But let's hope we don't get to that point.
Yes, and I agree with David, and I think that, again, we all benefit from its operation. I think it's the case that we, proportionately per capita, however we want to measure it, share more information with EU member states than is shared with us. But again, with security, it's never entirely a zero-sum game. There are alternatives. Fundamentally, the question comes down to, as David mentioned, ECJ jurisdiction. But SIS2, when they came in, I think just towards the end of Tony Blair's time as Prime Minister. So, there is an argument to be made that while it is a useful tool, it's not an essential tool in maintaining national security. And there are, through other methods of police and security service cooperation, a number of ways in which we can operate effectively. It's also the case, as I've touched on before with this committee, that Border Force and others believe that if we have the right sort of border controls and we accumulate intelligence ourselves through flows of goods and flows of individuals, that we may be able to better protect our borders than is the case at the moment. But that, of course, is open to debate.
Can I then, thank you very much. Can I just follow up briefly on another database, the PROOM database, DNA, fingerprints, vehicle registrations. And when we opted into that in 2015, the government said it was in the national interest as it helps us to identify foreign criminals and serious crimes. And Richard Martin said that accessing crime scene data through PROOM took 15 minutes, whereas under the previous system, it took 4 months. Are we going to go back to taking 4 months to access crime scene data?
Well, I hope not. We are having a relatively constructive discussions on PROOM. There are still some differences between us on that, but PROOM is rather like many of the tools in this area, where we're actually having quite constructive discussions on the substance of the tools, but we can't accept the conditions that the EU imposed by way of ECJ involvement, arbitration, data adequacy, the ETHR as they frame it, and so on. So we're positive about PROOM and actually many other areas in this if we can find a way through those questions of principle, although they, as we said, they look pretty difficult. But let's see if we can move forward somehow.
Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Lord Ricketts, indeed. And could I move to Lord Cavendish, please?
Thank you and good afternoon. My question concerns transparency. And I hope it's very clear to you that the publication of the UK draft text hugely enhances our ability as a committee to scrutinise negotiations. However, the letter received by our chair of the 19th of May says that you only published these because of the EU's insistence on sharing them with member states. I think the committee would like to know whether greater transparency and openness could be expected in the future. And will the government commit to publishing updates text in a timely fashion as its negotiating positions develops, rather than waiting for 2 months?
Yes, thank you very much, Lord Cavendish. I think the fact that the EU were publishing their own text was only one factor. The EU, I think, were making, I don't want to be unfair to but the Commission were making a virtue out of necessity, because sharing those texts with the other 27, with the 27 member states would have meant that they would have inevitably leaked out. Our view was that, as you know, in many trade negotiations, texts aren't aren't published in the detail that we have, but we also felt that it was important that people saw that what we were asking for were a series of precedented arrangements. So, of course, the EU's position was one factor, but a desire to make sure that you and others could see that our requests were not excessive was another. And of course, should anything change, then we will be as determined as possible to share everything with Parliament as quickly as possible.
Thank you. Mr. Frost, from your point of view, what harm would have resulted from publishing those draft texts at the same time as the EU published its draft agreements back in March?
I think our view was that we were and are trying to begin a rapid and complicated textual negotiation in good faith, and we had hoped, I mean, as is normal in international negotiations, that you keep those textual negotiations sort of in-house amongst negotiators to see if you can move forward and find constructive compromises. So we wanted to preserve a bit of space to do that. That isn't quite how things developed for various reasons, including the COVID crisis, but not only that. And it became clear that it was simply easier and more constructive to make them available to all. So that's why. And I don't think any harm would have resulted, but we wanted to preserve some negotiating space to see if we could move things forward. That didn't happen in quite that way.
Thank you. Might I make the point that our draft texts do not cover a number of areas we might have expected to see, such as public procurement and the participation in EU programs. Are they going to be forthcoming in the future?
So on procurement, we don't see the need to have a chapter in the free trade agreement. There is the WTO government procurement agreement, which we will be party to and seems to do everything we need to. So we intend to develop our own procurement arrangements in our own way in future, because those of the EU have been relatively sort of inefficient. So that's where we are on that. On programs, as I said, I think we tend to think it makes more sense to work off EU texts, given that they're EU programs in that particular limited area.
Since I have a few seconds left, I'm going to bail another one at you, separate subject. Is the government going to hold the EU to its commitments under Article 184 to work on alternatives to supersede the protocol in the context of FTA talks to ensure they do not become permanent?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Lord Cavendish. I just wanted to give you a progress report about how we're doing. We have, after me, I'm going to ask a couple of short questions in a moment, two more committee colleagues for their 5-minute slots. And that would see us finish around about 4:05, which is 5 minutes after the original allotted time. There are 5 other members of the committee who've put in to ask supplemental questions, and I wondered if you would be able or agreeable to stay for a further quarter of an hour in order to answer those questions.
I have a medical engagement at 4:30. If we can finish at 4:15, I would be very grateful.
Okay, we will certainly finish at 4:15. Perhaps I could. I will ask my questions. I was really going back to a theme, Mr. Gove, that you and I discussed earlier in the month in terms of the interparliamentary work and the proposal in the EU institutional framework section of their draft texts of a parliamentary partnership assembly. You had said that it is for Parliament to decide on the exact format for the interparliamentary dialogue earlier in the month. And the EU's draft legal text, in fact, states that the proposed Parliamentary Partnership Assembly would establish its own rules of procedure. And so that would seem to be a satisfactory answer to your original statement. So I wondered why the government hadn't been responding more positively on that part of the EU draft text.
Let me respond as positively as I can, and as I believe Lord True has also. We think that it would be a good thing, subject to the caveats that I entered the committee the last time around, and so in a way, insofar as my blessing means anything, then cooperation between parliamentarians in our House of Commons and the European Parliament, I'm very, very happy to see prosper.
Yes, and I'm sorry to just go on more or less the same point, but another thing that concerned me was Michel Barnier, after the last negotiating round, in his pretty long statement, included some words, and I'm just going to read them out. Why does the UK refuse to include consultation mechanisms with our European and British parliaments in our future agreement? And I just wondered what your answer to that was.
Well, I think that it comes back to the point that I sought to make earlier, which is that I'm hugely in favour of parliamentarians working together. But the one thing I just wanted to do was to make sure that there was no abridgment of the sovereignty of either the EU or the UK. That was all.
Thank you for that. We will move on then to Lord Faulkner.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. I should start by reminding you of my interest as the government's trade envoy to Taiwan, which I suspect Mr. Frost will know quite well from his previous life with the Scotch Whisky Association, as Taiwan is the 6th largest whisky market in the world, and he's nodding his approval of that, and I'm not my approval as well, worth 168, 170 million pounds a year. Can I ask whether there are any particular areas of negotiation with the EU that could come into conflict with other trade agreements the government is pursuing, such as with, for example, Japan, the United States, Australia, or New Zealand? And if so, what are those conflicts?
So the short answer is no, we don't think there are. If we had been trying to negotiate a kind of high alignment arrangement with the EU in which we accepted large parts of EU regulation, product regulation and similar, then we would have had a problem, because we wouldn't have had total discretion to waive or change our regulatory rules in the context of other trade agreements. Since we're not doing that, it's not a problem. We have discretion over our own laws and our own regulations, and we can tailor them as we see fit in any free trade agreement that we conduct. Obviously, always with the sort of precondition and the presumption that we're a high standards country, and we take that forward into those negotiations. But I don't think there's any sense in which decisions in one context actually prejudge or control or constrain negotiations in others, except possibly in some marginal areas, but not on the fundamentals.
When we have a number of negotiations on the go at the same time, how sure can we be that there won't be conflict between them? How can we keep them interrelated? Is that one Mr. Gove might answer, perhaps?
Well, we have very effective coordination of our approach towards different negotiations through the Access Committee. The name implies that it's principally about our exit from the European Union, but it's also a forum in which cabinet ministers meet. And today, well, actually, I can't say too much because it's a cabinet committee. But today we met, and there was an opportunity for us to congratulate some of the individual members of that committee on progress in precisely this area.
And if I could just add, perhaps, every other country in the world manages to conduct a program of negotiation of free trade agreements and keep them in step and do so effectively. And we believe we'll be capable of doing that as well in the future.
Well, as the Chancellor has let the committee in on a secret of the Cabinet, you may be aware that the trade envoys last week were sent briefing by the Department of Trade about the UK Global Tariff initiative, which is, I gather, to come into effect on the 1st of January next year. Can you say how you think that is going to affect relationships with Europe? I mean, as far as my work in Taiwan is concerned, I think it's all good news because I can only see tariffs coming down. I can't see there being any risk of tariffs going up, but it may not be the same elsewhere.
Well, in terms of the EU relationship, obviously, if we do not succeed in getting an agreement with the EU, then, as we were saying earlier, tariffs will come in, although our regime is less protectionist than the EU's common external tariff. Obviously, we don't want to get to that point, but it could happen. The importance of the announcement is simply that it's important to know your baseline. In any trade agreement, you need to know what will happen if you don't reach agreement, and that is now clear with the announcement of this tariff. So that it provides a degree of clarity and certainty that probably was not quite there before.
And the UK Global Tariff initiative is one that is going to be announced properly, is it, in due course? Because I didn't read anything about it last week.
It has been announced. It may be that other news got in the way, but we definitely announced it.
It was a relatively low-key announcement in that respect. More attention was paid by the media to the publication of the command paper on the Northern Ireland Protocol that day. And I think also the fact that we'd published previous schedules in the event of a no-deal exit had meant that people were broadly understanding of the shape of it, even though it was more liberal, actually, than any previous iteration.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. So we come to our last committee member, so patient and certainly not least, Baroness Verma.
Thank you, Lord Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Gove and Mr. Frost. Mr. Gove, do you continue to believe there is a serious risk that the EU will not fulfil its obligations under the withdrawal agreement on the rights of UK citizens by the time the transition period ends this December? And have you heard what actions the Commission is expecting to take to address your concerns following your letter to the EU's co-chair of the Joint Committee, Maros Sefcovic, dated on the 14th of May? And are you confident that the EU is demonstrating a balanced approach in the way UK nationals are being treated for guaranteed citizenship rights? And if I may quickly add to Mr. Frost, have all EU member states announced their settlement schemes to be open? And in your view, do you believe that enough has been done to give information communicated out regularly for UK nationals to apply if they so choose to? And of those member states that are lagging behind, have they been asked for any guidance?
Thank you very much, Baroness Verma, for your question. The letter to Vice President Sefcovic, I think, has been well understood by him and his Commission colleagues, and we'll have an opportunity at the next meeting of the Withdrawal Agreement Joint Committee next month to follow up on that. But I know that Vice President Sefcovic takes those responsibilities very seriously, and he will be pursuing them with member states.
Yes, and not much to add, really, to be honest. We know that, I mean, as CDL set out in his letter, there are some areas where implementation has gone more slowly for good reasons in some cases, for less good in others. There is still time to do something about that for all member states, and that's where we take the discussion at the moment. I think it's fair to say it's not been ideal everywhere, but we have not got into naming names, and we believe that just as we fulfil our legal obligations, the EU and the member states will fulfil theirs.
Thank you. Mr. Gove, just very quickly, when we last met, you committed to reinforcing the argument for documentary proof of pre-settled and settled status of those wishing to settle in the UK. Has that been done?
No, but we are talking to the Home Office about it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, that is, as it were, the end of normal time. And in extra time, we have 5 members who are going to ask questions. I'm going to ask the first question, then it'll be Baroness Cootie, then Lord Oates, then Lord Teverson, and to bring us home, Lord Kerr. I would be grateful if my colleagues could stick to 2 minutes in this section so that Mr. Gove can get to his medical meeting. I'm going to go first, and I'm building ready on something that was raised by Baroness Brown right at the start of what was going on. It does seem that the negotiations at the moment would be heading very likely to some sort of agreement quite late in the year, in October or November, for example, which would leave very little time for businesses and others to prepare for the new world. And they're, of course, beset by COVID-19 at the moment. And I wondered what mechanisms you're considering for facilitating the transition from the transition period to the new world, as it were.
Well, I'll say 2 things. As David indicated earlier, in broad terms, we expect fruitful talks to carry on after June. We hope fervently that they do. We will do everything to ensure that they can. But there may come a point in the autumn when, despite our best efforts and indeed the good faith of others, it becomes clear that we're not going to get the agreement that we want. We will do everything possible to do that. Were it to be the case that we weren't, then it might become, as your question implies, imperative that we provide certainty, and it would be my responsibility to ensure that our arrangements at the border and the requirements placed on business and others were clear, and we propose to say a little bit more about that in the next couple of weeks.
Yes, no, if I could just add, my personal view is October, November is getting a bit late for this, both for readiness purposes here in the UK and also for ratification, text preparation, all the things that need to be done. And I hope that decision makers in the EU member states are not thinking that this can be safely deferred until October or November, and that they don't have to think hard about the politics of it all until then. I think that would be getting a bit late to think of an agreement.
Thank you for that. Obviously, it opens up a lot of other questions, but I'm afraid over to Baroness Cootie.
I've got 2 very quick questions. Firstly, following up on the discussion we were having earlier, you mentioned that we were hoping to get mutual recognition of standards. How and by whom is that going to be conducted, as over time we potentially diverge from the EU standards? And is there a possibility that the decisions may be political as opposed to based on quality?
So there are 2 things there. I'll try and be succinct. Mutual recognition of standards is when you have 2 different standards, but a process for saying they basically do the same thing.
Yeah, I understand that. Yeah.
That is not what we are seeking. We are seeking a position where, in theory, and no doubt in reality, UK standards in some products might be different from EU standards. But if you're a UK manufacturer who wants to export to the EU, obviously you must meet the EU standards. What we would hope, and what is normal in free trade agreements, is that you agree that the UK regulator can assess your products against the EU standards as well as the UK ones. So you don't have to go through an assessment process twice by two different regulators. So that's very normal in free trade agreements in Canada, it's in many others. At the moment, it's not on offer to us, which we find a bit surprising, but perhaps we'll get there before this process is over.
Great, thank you. And the other very, very quick question is following up on Baroness Donaghy's point about professional qualifications. Am I not right in thinking that at the moment we have potentially mutual recognition of professional qualifications across the EU, but practically each jurisdiction or each country within the EU can add their own kinks to it, which actually means in practice that some professions find it very hard to have their qualifications recognised in those countries? And what do you see in our free trade agreement that could possibly be better than that and actually help? I mean,
well, you're right. Just very briefly, it has been very controversial, and obviously there have been some famous cases of ski instructors and in France and so on that have attracted attention, most of which have been resolved. It has always been complex, and the rules give quite a lot of discretion to member states. So I think it's fair to say it's never worked quite as smoothly as we would have wished. Obviously, all that is locked in the withdrawal agreement as of now, and it's the future and ongoing recognition, new pathways, new rules that is what's at stake, and that's why we want something that would work smoothly and clearly, and offer a decent chance of continued recognition.
does it look like you're going to get it? You're getting a warm reception?
We're having constructive discussions about it, but it's not one of the easier parts of the negotiation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Lord Oates.
Thank you, Lord Chairman. I just want to return to the issue of level playing fields. The government's February paper on negotiating the future relationship with the EU made much of our position as sovereign equals of the EU. But Mr. Gove, isn't the problem that we face that while we're undoubtedly sovereign equals, we're not economic equals, given them our market of 60 million plus versus theirs of 400 million plus? And given that imbalance, could you tell us what evidence informed the government's belief that it was likely to be able to successfully negotiate comprehensive access to the EU market whilst refusing a continuing level playing field with that market?
Well, huge question. The first thing to say is that what the EU is asking of us is unprecedented in any of the free trade agreements that they've signed with, or indeed contemplated signing with other economies. But what the EU does interpret is geography as requiring those countries which are on its border or within its periphery, within what it might consider in old-fashioned terms to be its sphere of influence, to sign up to a higher level of compliance with EU rules and a higher level of EU supervision of their institutions than it requires of other countries. Now, my view is that that is a fundamentally illiberal approach, because you're saying to a sovereign equal, just because of geography, that you have to accept us as a entity. That's the sort of approach that in the 19th century empires took, and it's the sort of approach that in a world where you do have sovereign equals, you want to move away from. Now, I understand why the EU might want to do that, but part of recognising that we're a sovereign equal is recognising it's entirely for the EU to decide the level of access that it wants us to have to their markets. But it cannot be the case that they say, just because you're in the continent of Europe, that you have to accept the sovereignty of Europe.
And if I could just add, that's absolutely right. And if I could just add, I think the EU itself is not consistent on this. Sometimes it says, as Barnier said at one of his press conferences, that we're too small to expect an equal relationship. The power relationship is not equal. Yet, for the purposes of the level playing field rules, they say we're too big. We're too big and threatening. We're too big an economy and too close to expect the same kind of terms. So I don't really see how you can run those arguments simultaneously. You have to choose which one.
Thank you very much. Lord Teverson.
Thank you, Lord Chairman. I'd like to just ask a question very briefly about Euratom, which we seem to have forgotten, rather, in that this was always seen as a very useful institution and potentially post-Brexit in terms of everything from medical, low energy, low carbon energy, but particularly research. And I wondered, there was a lot of question or talk about an association agreement with Euratom, and I wonder where we were on that.
So what we are seeking to negotiate is a standalone nuclear cooperation agreement with Euratom, which is a pretty standard thing kind of globally, such that there are plenty of such agreements amongst countries with nuclear power. And actually this is a pretty constructive bit of the negotiation. We don't agree with the EU on everything. They want to make it part of the overall treaty rather than freestanding. We don't agree with what they've put forward on dispute settlement for the usual reasons, but in principle, this is quite a constructive negotiation, and I think it's got a good chance of coming out successfully.
That's very good to hear. In terms, one of the important things about Euratom was its freedom of movement and the scientific community being able to move around. Is that something that will still be possible?
Well, that's a different aspect of it. The EU is proposing that there should be incorporated into the treaty specific provisions for freedom of movement of researchers and indeed some other categories of citizens. We are not attracted to that. We think those rules are better set by us, that we are in control of our own immigration agreements, and we have made it clear that we want this country to be one of the best places for people to come and do science, and we have some particular new rules in place to attract scientists and researchers, but we think those are best controlled by us and not locked into an EU treaty in future.
Thank you very much indeed. We move therefore to our very last question from Lord Kerr.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I'd like to take Mr. Gove back to where you and Lord Wood ended the exchange with Mr. Frost at the beginning. Mr. Frost admitted that the negotiation is not quite where you hoped it would be, and I'm not at all surprised about that. The virus turned out to be rather more serious than the Prime Minister had suggested at the beginning of February, and the disruption that it's caused must have made this negotiation very difficult. No face-to-face meetings. You've lost staff to go off and work on the virus rather than on this negotiation. Your commitment, your promise that there would be no extension, that you would turn down any proposal of an extension, preceded the virus. Are you sure that given all this disruption, that promise still makes sense, given that it seems pretty clear that no extension is going to mean no deal?
Yes. A small piece of autobiography. Before I married my wife, I was enjoying all the time that I spent with her. And she said, "This is all very well, Michael, but you've got to decide by next week whether or not you want to marry me or not. And if you don't decide by that time, then I'm afraid it's going to be someone else." And I realized then that I was missing out on perhaps the greatest, what's the word, pleasure, achievement, love of my life. So I then said, resolved internally to meet that deadline and to to celebrate that union. It seems to me that deadlines can make sure that minds are concentrated.
Who else did she have in mind, Mr. Gove?
Well, I think if she'd met Lord Wood, then I think that she would never have hung around with me.
Fair point.
Well, thank you very much indeed, both of you. It's been a very wide-ranging discussion, and you've answered all our questions with admirable crispness, and we look forward very much to seeing you again in the near future, I regret. Thank you also for volunteering to write a letter on clearinghouses. It's something which we are, as a general committee, interested in, and that is much appreciated. And I suppose good luck in the coming weeks. I think it's important for all 500 million people affected by this that that good results come of the current negotiations. So with that, I declare the meeting over, and Mr. Gove, hopefully you will get to your medical meeting on time.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.